To introduce myself really briefly, I come out of the Bay Area political movement, and what's most probably relevant for the panel tonight is that I was also a member of STORM, standing together to organize a revolutionary movement. Ben was a friend and comrade of mine for many, many years. And I think it's probably disorienting for a lot of us, right, to be having this panel that's named the Van Jones Effect, right, and actually was disorienting to see a lot of these Glenn Beck videos, right, because he's a person we know, he's a human being, right, that we know and a comrade that we've been side by side with at different times. How many folks, just to sort of get a sense, how many folks in this room have known or have worked with Van in the past? Right, so it's a lot of us, right? Just want to name, it's sort of strange to talk somebody about somebody you know like a figure, right? But I think we all realize that this is an important moment, right? That what's happening and what happened here with Van and his resignation is an important moment around this question of red baiting and race baiting, but also probably more importantly that this is much bigger than Van. What's happening right now in terms of politics in this country, there's a struggle that's happening. Obviously there's a struggle that's been happening for a long time, but in terms of what's going on with the Obama administration, these policies and so on, and popular culture, right, there's a much bigger thing than Van that's going on right now that we need to figure out how we're going to position ourselves within that, what we're going to do. And I think a lot of us see this less as like the turning point, the moment, than a good wake-up call, right? People have been talking for months about the Obama moment and the opportunities and so on, or the challenges. This was a moment that really revealed that we haven't really stepped up. So tonight is a really exciting panel because it gives us a chance to do some of that reflection and to start getting deeper, right? And to take that wake-up call as an opportunity to actually wake up, right? And start to do something.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the Brecht Forum for inviting me to speak. And thanks to all of you for coming out on short notice for what is a critical conversation about the state of the left and the state of the right. I think that one thing that Van, I'm going to just sort of lay out some housekeeping, like get some stuff out of the way. I didn't know Van all that well, so I'm really not going to comment on Van the individual. But one thing that I think he was absolutely correct about is that the right knows how to fight. They know how to fight, and they know how to win. So that's one of the things that I'm actually going to get into. That's one of the points. The two other points that I want to do, one before that, is to actually lay out what I think are two of the pivotal elements of the political economic context that we need to understand in order to understand what's going on with the right-wing upsurge and what led to Van's resignation. And then lastly, I want to lay out what I think are both critical short-term and intermediate tasks for the left so that we don't wander our way into the dustbin. So with that, I guess I will keep going. So the first one, the context. There's a dual crisis that's happening, and that's economic. So the largest economic meltdown in history since the Great Depression. And on the other hand, it's the legitimacy of the state. Will you give me time every minute? So crisis of legitimacy of the state. So from top to bottom, what we're seeing is basically this destabilization of both the working class, the ruling class, and everybody in between. And so there's a realignment and competition and competing that's going on, particularly within the ruling class elements, around who's going to claim the throne of power and sort of lead us into the next stage of whatever happens to be the next stage of capitalism, right? So that's a huge fight. It's material and it's ideological. Second, the other two material components is that it's the largest government bailout in history ever globally, and it's a jobless recovery. So that leads to the ideological component, or the crisis of legitimacy of the state. Can the state do anything to save ordinary people, right? Right-wing neoliberalism of the last 30 years says that there should be no state intervention, and we have right-wing populism coming in saying the same thing, move the state out of the way. So the conditions are primed for right-wing populism to come into the play. And so that is why we need to recognize that the real danger right now is not Van Jones or Obama or the Democrats. The real threat right now is the right. So because the economic and the material and ideological conditions are so severe right now, the right is essentially engaging in a strategy of encirclement or strangulation. They're cutting out the base and criticizing people of color and those who are most affected by the economic crisis by attacking Acorn. They're going after the policies that could actually have an impact on those people, like healthcare, and they're coming in with anti-communism red baiting. So they're basically trying to strangulate the progressive left, and they're going after the left flank the hardest. For these reasons, our primary task right now as the left needs to be engaging the right in the fight to win the frame and win the battle of ideas, win the battle for the hearts and minds of the country. And what that means is confronting racism, confronting the red baiting, taking on the right wing, and pushing our progressive friends who may or may not be in this room to actually call out the red baiting. There's been a lot of talk about the race baiting. That needs to continue, but unless we protect the left flank of the movement, we're going to be in some real danger. We need to support the real-time work that's happening on the ground, especially at where those forces that represent the intersectionality of oppressions are actually engaged in the fight. And we need to continue to do that education. And then lastly, I would say we need to engage in the fight for power. That's the midterm task for us right now. And that does involve an inside-outside strategy, and I don't want to disabuse anybody in the room who thinks that Van Jones was an inside-outside strategy. That was not an inside-outside strategy. An inside-outside strategy that actually involves building an independent and autonomous left base within the working class that actually engages in electoral politics, reform struggles, and fights for power. So the battlefield has been engaged. It's time to suit up, and we have no time to waste.
And I just wanted to start again thanking the Brecht Forum and how crucial it is that we have a space that enables us to have these kind of discussions. Bertolt Brecht is one of my favorite playwrights, and I think it's appropriate that we do this here because Brecht actually left the United States of America, where he had come as a refugee from the fascism of Europe, didn't have the best time in Hollywood, but then when the McCarthy era came, he was called before the HUAC hearings, and Brecht was not a party member, but he was a communist, and is probably one of the few people who ever left the United States of America to go to East Germany for artistic freedom. And so if we want to understand what McCarthyism is or what red baiting is, it's a powerful thing. It's so powerful that it took arguably the greatest playwright of 20th century Europe and made him return to a country governed by the Stasi so he could put on plays. And so the question, I think, which Randy bring about what is this anti-communism, why is it so important? And I also think this bears pretty directly on inside-outside strategies. In American history, the greatest proponent of attempting to build reform struggles while building an independent political base was the Communist Party. And its heyday was in the 1930s, and it led movements here in New York of hundreds of thousands of people. And it got real reforms. I mean, we're talking rent control, right? You know, Stan Levinson, you know, that's a hero. That was a Jewish communist who went and fought for civil rights in this country, was really out there on the ground. And this has been written out of the history of this country in a lot of ways. One of the things that happened was it's not always clear in a society what the range of political discussion is going to be. And for a period, communists had access to the White House during the FDR administration, and this was real. And when things switched around, they decided that was not going to be allowed anymore. That this thing called communism, you could talk about socialism a little, you could talk about whatever, but when it came to challenging capitalism, white supremacy, and US imperialism, those things were off the table. And I don't just want to use rhetoric because in the United States of America, these are key concepts in terms of how we structure and understand our country. there was this movement of communism that had one foot in both camps. On one level, it wanted democratic reforms, and on another was actually fighting for a fundamentally new society where people weren't made objects but were the masters of their own destiny. And I think we can look around the world right now, and it's not just here where we face this problem. We have a neoliberal capitalist society that's failing to meet the needs of the vast majority of people. On one hand, we have people like Glenn Beck, right, what we'll call the fascist hordes, and they are out there, and they are genuinely dangerous. You know, I don't think this is a crowd that we need to engage in that discussion, but when you look at him, you say, that is my enemy. There's no confusion about that. This person thinks some people are not invested with rights and other people are fully entitled. So part of what happens is when the left becomes the defenders of liberal imperialism, it is the far right that always makes the gains. So this gives us a difficult situation because the far right is really dangerous and they really will kill us. And at the same time, these liberal, you know, Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer, our New York Democrats, these are not our allies and we're not actually in a coalition with them. So if we're in a situation where we go out to the masses of working people, let alone on a global scale, because again, they've already made clear that Arabs can die and the war will continue. If we go out to people in this country as primarily defenders of a liberal capitalist social order, many people outside the self-identified left will only find succor from the far right. And we've seen this happen before in history, and it happened in Germany, and it happened in Europe, and it's happened over large parts of this earth, right, where people demanding democratic rights were not able to build the independent political positions of working class and oppressed nations. If we aren't able to build independent and combative organizations able to do that, we will always fight on our enemy's terrain, and we will continue to lose every reform and radical battle as we have our entire life. My entire life has seen liberals in charge of what we can fight for while we defend a bankrupt welfare system, bankrupt schools, and a broken society. And we're not getting it, and people drop out of politics and learn to fight for and do for self. And we have to go right up into the face of that. We have to be utterly combative, and we have to come together and build these, as we say, we're going to argue over independence and what that means. But if we cannot engage in a systematic fight against the entire ruling regime and not just the people who poke their fingers in our eyes, we're going to get steamrolled. And the last thing I just sort of wanted to mention that is I don't believe politics is a spectrum. I don't believe we're going to pull the Obama administration anywhere. They know exactly what they're about. What he promised is what he's delivering. Goldman Sachs is in charge of the economy, just like they were under Bush, and the same people are running our military, and they're expanding, I just want to say it again, they're expanding this war into Pakistan. And if people don't quite understand what that means, it's over 100 million people, and they're not going to put up with it. So the fight's coming. And the last point, I think it's wonderful to be on a panel where people are going to disagree, and I think it's important that we not reproduce the mistakes of the past. And in particular, I mean sectarianism and moralizing political discussions. As with Harmony, I also knew Van, and when he renounced the communist movement and embraced capitalism and embraced this state, I disagreed, but again, we can meet people down the road, and we don't have to apply scorched earth tactics to each other. Our enemy is the system, and I just really want to say that because it's going to be a tough fight that we're entering in these coming days. Thank you.
Like anyone who's on the left, I had definitely criticisms around this whole greening the ghetto thing. What does that mean? And it's interesting that I work in an organization that is doing this kind of work, and to see what it was doing, I prefer not to mention. I am concerned about like funding and all these other things that go into play with organizations right now in the sort of larger base of social justice organizations in the city because of this attack and because of the way that things get spinned. But I work in the Bronx. There's several organizations that are working on green issues, some of them that are more progressive, some of them that are looking towards establishing a new system, a way for people in our community to have jobs, which would be these green jobs, particularly in weatherization and construction. And participating in these coalitions, what I've realized is that this is something that's really hitting at the core of a lot of what the left talks about. And it could be projected as something that is a radical alternative as opposed to just something that embraces the capitalist system. And the reason why I say this is because instead of just having the campaign model of, where, for instance, we want to build more schools in the neighborhood and like, what do we need to do that? And mobilizing communities around that strategy and targeting particular politicians, we're actually engaging unions and we're engaging folks who want to teach people skills in terms of how to run a weatherization program, engaging people who are formerly incarcerated to have jobs in construction, people who don't have jobs. We're engaging folks who are obese and have issues around health. We are engaging folks who have asthma. We are engaging folks who are suffering from lead poisoning. And all of this is happening in one way and as a full strategy. And I think it's not something that is easy to sort of write off. And I think some of the other points I wanted to make was that I see this attack on Van as part of a consistent strategy that's used by the elite in terms of targeting the masses. And I was rereading some of my books in terms of media studies and looking at things like how crowds are targeted, particularly the seduction that we have in terms of images and the appeal that images have for us. And so looking at this and also looking at who is being attacked, right? We see Reverend Wright, we see Van Jones, we see the picture of Mumia up there. It is these voices, particularly of black men, who are also messengers and effective messengers, right? They've been able to effectively message to the left and also within these inner circles of the right and in the Conservative Party. And so I feel like working in one of these types of organizations, I did come up with some ideas about things that could be done. I really love Kazimbe's question that he posed to us as panelists. He said, how does the left get its groove back? I think this idea of groove, right, this idea of music, right, this idea of movement, and being in touch with that speaks to the effect, how effective the right has been at being in touch with those things. So we lose our groove if we just focus on the issues, and we're not dealing with what are the underlying dreams, what are the emotions, the values, the culture that guide our movements, and how do we connect to that, right? How are we effectively doing that with our music, with our culture? I have questions about people, say, within these reformist movements, they're actively blocking out ideas, right? We can't talk about Palestine, the fact that I can't mention the organization I work, all of these things lead to the fact that there is this censorship within the reformist movement. How do we address that censorship? And how do we communicate, like as Jez was saying, how do we communicate directly to people as opposed to always relying on social justice organizations, unions, or these institutional structures? How do we get to these people? And that's a really central question. Study these tools of seduction and the roles of images and their effect on broadening the capacity of our movement. Plugging in strategically into reform movements, but not becoming a slave to these campaigns. Being consistent and respectful agitators. I was in a meeting yesterday, we were talking about healthcare, and it's like, what is the right strategy? And as radicals, our role is to say in these meetings, like, we need a socialist strategy, or we need single payer, or whatever, because there is a sort of dominant discourse in terms of organization and structure that's saying, we all have to adopt this Obama public option strategy, and this filters down, so it's okay. So it's very important. I just have 2 more points. I think that the left should offer to do political education within mass-based organizations and unions. I think that we should create more messengers and agitators as a defense team. We have Cop Watch. What about Speaker Watch? What about Media Watch? How are we defending our own media and continuing to build our own media, whether that's YouTube editing like they're doing here, blogging, building these grassroots institutions. I would say Kasama, Democracy Now! These are things that we should continue to build, these alternative media institutions. Thank you.
But my name is Rosa Clemente. I'm a community organizer I'm really happy to be back in the Bronx where I grew up after running with Cynthia for this Green Party nomination. So I obviously never expected anything from the Obama administration, and I never considered Van Jones left. I've actually always considered him a moderate. Particularly, although I appreciate the green collar economy, any economy steeped in capitalism is already failing. And it's interesting that around these green jobs, to me, it almost seems like it's the new trend. Like 10 years ago when me and G were still on the ground, it was police brutality, right? So here come the people's power doing things like drop the rock, right? So now 10 years later, when these Rockefeller drug laws pass, you would never know that the people who actually started that movement were people of color, because the nonprofit world saw it as profitable to now not manage. The nonprofit world is not here to solve problems, it's here to manage problems. And I learned this really quickly in my 2-month stint at Amnesty International. They were not there to solve human rights, they're there to manage it so they could keep getting money. Because effectively, if we solve these problems, we don't need an Amnesty International. We don't need these liberal groups that are not just white liberals. We got a lot of black and brown people that have been sold this out. And we just need to face the reality of the situation. We have all these, we're setting up an entire generation right now for failure. There is no job development in this country. We have to stop acting like green jobs is gonna save anybody. It's gonna get a little people into another kind of middle class position. That's all it's there for. It's there to stem the tide of a real people's revolution in this country, however that effectively can come from. So what we've seen is not only the left and us having introspection in ourselves, we have to understand that we're under attack on a daily basis. COINTELPRO doesn't stop just because they stop shooting young lords or the brown berets or the Black Panthers. It works in other insidious ways. So when this whole Van Jones thing came down, I think it was a shock to the people who voted for Obama, right? And so, but the reality is, coming out of the hip-hop political movement, which I actually think at this point is completely ineffective, completely male-dominated, and completely flushed with particularly Democratic money. And that's a hard thing for me to admit as someone who saw the potential of a hip-hop political movement, especially within 2003 in the National Hip Hop Political Convention. But within 6 years, that whole movement's been co-opted. So I think a lot of us are definitely reflecting, but I think struggle is struggle, right? We always have to understand that this is protracted. And I think one of the main things that we have to have is what G said. We need an infrastructure of accountability, right? So, and I think that's critically important. I think people really better give up the hope that the Democratic Party will ever do anything for those who are part of the Democratic Party. Really, like, I'm sorry, it's pretty much deaded. They're not gonna ever do anything as a party. And I think the sad thing for me about this situation is that Van Jones got in that position particularly because of young people voting. Whether they voted for the Green Party or not, we cannot underestimate the power of young people in this election. He had an ultimate responsibility to fight the fight. For whatever reason, he was forced to resign, or, you know, people make their decisions. We forget that there's a lot of death threats that I'm sure Van's been getting from the right wing. And you have to then make decisions on how you're gonna protect yourself and your family. But today, he sends out a letter, and in unequivocal terms, he says he still supports the Obama administration. Dude, then you know what? Stay in the moderate side, man, because all these people, especially young people from a lot of spectrums in our movement who are saying, no matter if we think you're left or that radical, how you were treated was a disrespect, and we have to hold the administration accountable for that. Your first message to those same people is, I love America, I'm down with Obama, let's get health care passed. To me, that shows us right now we have to get young people particularly to stop having icons in our movement. He's not a martyr. A lot of more powerful folks are doing a lot of more time in prison. You know, I hate the attack against him, but we cannot make him into a martyr. And if he was about revolutionary change, he'd be out there saying something about this administration that wants to pass a health care bill and has a president say no illegal immigrants will be covered. Right there, I don't want that health care bill passed, straight up. It's bullshit. And I'm coming hard because how dare we have a black man, the president of the United States, say on that stage illegal immigrants won't be covered, and we have not had a peep come out from any aspects of this movement. So I think people put out a lot of solutions out here, you know, and I think they're all relevant. You know, and I think yesterday shows us, particularly in New York, that a vast majority of people have no faith in electoral politics. So how do we shift all that energy? The lowest primary voter turnout rate ever. What does that mean? And I'm not saying everybody join the Green Party, because the Green Party obviously has its problems. Green Party coined the term single-payer health care and has been silent in this debate for various reasons. So that's just some of my thoughts and perceptions of what's going on. I know people will disagree, and I'm on time, right? Yeah. Okay, cool.
But I guess I want to put this in context, right, to understand. I want to talk about a couple of things. The attack on Van, the attack on like progressive forces from the spokesperson of the right, Glenn Beck, right? To understand that in the last 2 weeks, it's not only Van that's been attacked, and also some reaction has happened. Van's been attacked, Van resigned. Another brother named Yossi Sargent in the National Endowment of Arts was attacked and targeted by Glenn Beck, and he's been demoted in his position. Another brother named Mark Lloyd was attacked by Glenn Beck, and I think he's being moved around. He's in the FCC. What's important about these attacks, right, to understand the context is understand that all the people he attacked were in some way, one, very progressive in their politics, but also was connected to organizing efforts. You know, they weren't just regular liberal progressive politicians. They were people who connected organizing. People already know Van's history. Yossi Sargent was the guy who went to Shepard Fairey and said, you know, when Shepard Fairey made that iconic image of Obama, he's the one that came with the strategy of actually popularizing that image, and which propelled him to the position he's at. But more importantly, he just set up a meeting of different cultural youth organizing organizations to have a meeting with the Obama administration to talk about more money to the creativity stimulus that's been coined by Jeff Chang. Mark Floyd, who was a very progressive. Lloyd? Mark Lloyd, that go? Yep. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I was all into it. Yeah. Sorry. I don't get to stage a lot.
I'm with you, man. I experienced it too.
Mark Lloyd, that's his name? Right? He's a brother that's an FCC who was a former NBC other CBS producer, but also very progressive brother whose title was like Chief CEO Diversity. And Glenn Beck says that basically his job was to go around the country and be like, there's not enough people of color here, you need to get them positions of power, right? He's being moved around. You know, and he's been part of conferences, everything like that. To understand that is to say the attack is basically, part of the attack that's happening is one coming through culture and media, right? And I want to hop on what Lenina said, culture is very significant, but it's come through there, but it's also chopping away at the hope, which was one of the hopes of the Obama administration, at least for me and the people I dialogue with, right? That, you know, there was always, I think the left came out very early when Obama was appointing people who was former Clintonites, people who were reactionary in his administration, right? Everyone pointed them out. But then I said to one of my friends, like, you know, the best thing about Glenn Beck's recent special is I'm finding who's all the progressive people in the Obama administration, right? And that's very real, because me and my friends, we dialogue, that was one of our points. We knew of some progressive people who was in Obama's administration, and what was the importance of that, right? In the absence of a left. There is no left. I usually start my speaking points with saying there is no left, but G took that away from me. But you know, so there is no left, right? So then, like, these are the little points that we grasp onto for hope and also try to develop strategy and build a movement. Within that, I just really want to talk about, so, you know, we know what the attack is about. We know how it's coming down. I just really want to talk about what we need to do, right? What we need to do as the left. I want to jump into a little bit too, like what I originally saw as part of the hope of the Obama movement, right? What I focused on was his rhetoric, right? It didn't really matter to me materially what he did. One of the things that he did was his rhetoric, and the rhetoric of talking about hope and inspiring people's dreams, imaginations, and the rhetoric of talk about organizing. He gave us the biggest opening as the left, as people trying to do change ever, like one of the biggest in history, and that we should have been running with it. And I felt that most of the left just fell back and critiqued. And I think sometimes we feel that critiquing is what makes us left. And we forget about fighting for power and also how to win gains for people. We should be worried about winning gains, consolidating those gains, and then going beyond those gains to achieve revolution. Right now, I believe we're in a period of consolidating some gains that we got out of the Obama movement. Not just from Obama himself, but progressive people actually doing things actively, fighting for different changes. Got 1 minute. Within that, right, I want to give some examples I felt like of people using that, right? Running with what Obama did and said, and some of his rhetoric, and also how he organized people. That was the key thing, the use of open source technology. Not the technology, but the concept of open source organizing, right? Like that you could say, yeah, I made the Obama t-shirts for Obama. Yeah, I made this. I made the homeboys for Obama. Whatever, right? It was self-organized groups of people doing things, right? What we need to do is guide that and structure it. So one of the things I want to give an example is tomorrow night, I'm hosting an event called the Young Voices for Healthcare. It's an open mic. It's presented as a spoken word town hall for young people. There's been many articles talking about how young people have been missing from this debate. We proposed this project. We're getting it done at Habana Outpost tomorrow in Brooklyn, 7 o'clock p.m. What the significance of that has been that we just a few people that put this together, but we didn't realize there's just been this outpouring of people who's really been interested. There's a couple of groups nationally who want to copy it and go across, send it across nationally. The BBC is going to be there to record it live, and also hopefully interview the BBC on Saturday. And we just use that as one of the key things of usually it's something as healthcare and on a national level, a federal issue, like a national legislative, we're usually not involved, right? And there's a lot of reasons, there's capacity issues and things like that, but this could be one example of how we can make that leap. I could go in much details more talking about way past my time.